The morning air at the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Manhattan was crisp, smelling of expensive cologne and freshly roasted Starbucks reserve beans. I sat by the floor-to-ceiling window watching the city wake up. At 78, my routine was my sanctuary. I had spent 40 years as a lead security systems engineer, a job that taught me one thing: the most dangerous glitches are the ones you don't see coming. I was finishing my second espresso when he walked in. Julian, my only son. He was wearing a navy Brioni suit that probably cost more than my first house, but he looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. He was checking his iPhone 15 Pro every 10 seconds, his thumbs twitching. When he saw me, he put on a smile. It was a smile I had seen 1,000 times on the faces of corporate raiders, polished, bright, and completely hollow. "Dad, you're looking sharp," Julian said, his voice a pitch too high, echoing slightly against the marble floors. He sat down and immediately placed a small, heavy box on the table. It was wrapped in cream-colored paper with the unmistakable gold lettering of Patek Philippe. "What's this, Julian?" I asked, my voice steady, though my heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. "It's not my birthday." "Just a thank you gift," he said, leaning in. "For everything. I know I haven't been around much. The real estate market in the Hamptons is a meat grinder lately. Cynthia is stressed. I'm stressed. I just wanted you to know I appreciate you." He pushed the box toward me. Inside sat a Nautilus, a masterpiece of steel and sapphire. It was a $100,000 watch. But as I lifted it from the velvet cushion, I felt it. A minute weight imbalance, a tiny microscopic friction when I turned the bezel. Most people wouldn't notice it, but I didn't spend 4 decades securing federal buildings by ignoring microscopic anomalies. "It's beautiful," I lied. My eyes met his. For a split second, Julian's gaze flickered to the floor. That was the first red flag. A son who gives his father a $100,000 gift should be able to look him in the eye. "Put it on, Dad," he urged. "It has a built-in safety feature, a GPS sync for your health. You know, in case you ever wander," Cynthia insisted. "She worries about your heart." Cynthia, my daughter-in-law, the woman who treated people like chess pieces and the world like her personal Tiffany & Company catalog. If Cynthia insisted on a safety feature, it wasn't for my benefit. It was for hers. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. I looked at the watch again. Under the magnification of my memory, I realized the health sync wasn't a standard feature. It was a modification, a high-end military-grade tracking chip hidden behind the tourbillon. My son hadn't given me a timepiece. He had given me a leash. "I'll wear it to dinner tonight," I said, tucking the box into my Mont Blanc briefcase. "Tell Cynthia I'm touched." As Julian hurried away, citing a high-stakes meeting at a Park Avenue tower, I didn't finish my coffee. I walked out of the Ritz, my mind racing. Why would my son need to track a retired engineer? I wasn't a rich man, at least not in the way Julian and Cynthia measured wealth. My assets were tied up in a modest trust and my home in the Hamptons. I sat in my Mercedes S-Class, the cabin silent thanks to the acoustic glass. I opened my MacBook Pro and ran a quick scan of the local frequencies, using a specialized diagnostic tool I'd kept from my working days. The watch was screaming. It was broadcasting a high-frequency encrypted signal every 30 seconds, and the destination wasn't a health app. It was a private server hosted in a tax haven. The betrayal hit me then, not as a sharp pain, but as a dull, suffocating weight. This was the boy I had taught to build birdhouses. This was the boy I had sat up with when he had night terrors. Now he was treating his father like a high-value asset to be monitored, or worse, a target. I looked at the watch, the diamonds on the dial mocking me. They thought I was a relic. An old man who spent his days reading Marcus Aurelius and sipping tea. They forgot that I was the man who designed the very systems they were now trying to use against me. "You want to know where I am, Julian?" I whispered to the empty car. "I'll show you." I drove straight to the FedEx office near Grand Central. I took the watch out of the box, wrapped it in lead-lined foil I kept in my trunk for hardware transport, and placed it inside a standard shipping box. I addressed it to a defunct electronics recycling plant in Whitehorse, Yukon, deep in the Canadian wilderness. I paid for the priority overnight shipping using a prepaid card. As the clerk took the box, I felt a strange sense of liberation. For the next 24 hours, Cynthia and Julian would watch a little blue dot move across the North American continent at 500 miles per hour. They would think I was fleeing. They would panic. And in their panic, they would make mistakes. I walked back to my car, my hands finally stopping their tremble. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Elena," I said when the line picked up. "It's Arthur. I think the glitch I told you about years ago just went live. I need to know what my son is hiding in his basement, and I need to know by tonight." I looked up at the Manhattan skyline, the glass towers reflecting the cold morning sun. The game had started. They thought I was the prey. They had no idea that an old engineer knows exactly how to tear a system down, wire by wire, until there's nothing left but the truth. As I drove toward the Hamptons, I passed a billboard for one of Cynthia's luxury developments. "The future of living," it read. "No, Cynthia," I thought, gripping the leather steering wheel. "The future is about to get very, very expensive for you." The hunt was on, but for the first time in years, I wasn't the one afraid. I was the one holding the schematics, and I knew exactly where the structural weaknesses were hidden. The drive from the Ritz-Carlton to my estate in the Hamptons usually offered a sense of peace, but today, the Atlantic breeze felt like a cold warning. I parked my Mercedes S-Class in the circular driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires, a sound that usually signaled home, but now signaled a battlefield. Before entering, I checked my iPhone 15 Pro. The tracking signal I had redirected was currently moving through upstate New York at 70 miles per hour, courtesy of a FedEx truck. Julian and Cynthia would think I was making a run for the border. Inside, the house was silent, save for the hum of the Sub-Zero refrigerator. I went straight to my study, a room filled with leather-bound books and my collection of vintage Mont Blanc pens. I opened my MacBook Pro and accessed the encrypted cloud server I hadn't touched in years. If Julian was tracking me, it wasn't because of my health. It was because of the Sterling Legacy Trust, a multi-million-dollar fund my late wife and I had established for charity, which Julian desperately needed to cover his hemorrhaging real estate losses. The silence was broken by the chime of the doorbell. I checked the security feed on my iPad. It was Elena, my gardener, but today she wasn't wearing her usual grass-stained overalls. She was in a sharp, charcoal gray suit, holding a Starbucks cup as if it were a prop. I opened the door. "The roses need pruning, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping an octave into a professional, icy tone. "And the pests are closer than we thought." We sat in the kitchen. I poured us 2 glasses of sparkling water from the Viking dispenser. Elena placed a thin, transparent folder on the granite countertop. "Julian isn't just in debt, Arthur," she whispered, her eyes scanning the room for hidden microphones. "He's been leveraged by a shell company linked to Cynthia's latest development on 5th Avenue. They aren't just looking for your trust fund. They've been using your name, your reputation as a former federal security engineer, to bypass procurement protocols for high-end surveillance microchips." My blood ran cold. "They're using me as a ghost sender?" "Exactly," Elena replied, tapping her Apple Watch. "Those Patek Philippe watches? They aren't gifts. They are part of a shipment of military-grade processors disguised as luxury goods. They needed you to wear the prototype to calibrate the encrypted frequency against your home's old security grid. If the feds trace the signal, it leads straight to this house, straight to you." The realization hit me like a physical blow. My own son wasn't just stealing my money. He was stealing my honor, framing me for a crime that carried a sentence of life in prison. I looked at my hands, the hands that had built the security for the New York Stock Exchange, and realized they were being used to strangulate my own life. Suddenly my phone buzzed. It was a FaceTime call from Cynthia. I signaled Elena to stay quiet and answered. Cynthia's face appeared on the screen, framed by the opulent backdrop of her Manhattan penthouse. She was sipping a glass of Veuve Clicquot, her hair perfectly coiffed. Behind her, the lights of the Empire State Building glittered, cold and uncaring. "Arthur, darling," she chirped, though her eyes were predatory. "Julian says you left the city in quite a hurry. Is everything all right? We noticed your health tracker is moving toward Canada. Are you taking a spontaneous fishing trip?" I forced a chuckle, the kind of grandfatherly sound that had served as my mask for years. "You caught me, Cynthia. I needed some fresh air. The city was feeling congested. I thought I'd head up to the lodge." "Oh, how lovely," she said, her smile never reaching her eyes. "But you forgot your medication, didn't you? Julian is so worried. He's actually on his way to catch up with you. He should be there shortly. Why don't you stay put? It would be a shame if you got lost in the woods at your age." The threat was veiled in silk, but it was there. She wasn't checking on me. She was telling me I was being hunted. "I'll keep an eye out for him," I said, terminating the call. I turned to Elena. "How long do we have?" "If they're tracking that FedEx box, they'll realize the ruse within the hour," she said, pulling a compact Sig Sauer from a concealed holster. "But Julian is already on the Long Island Expressway. He's coming here to find the missing shipment he thinks you've hidden." I stood up, moving toward the basement, the place where I kept my real tools. "Let him come," I said. "He thinks he knows this house because he grew up here, but he forgot who designed the shadows." I reached into a hidden drawer and pulled out my old copy of The 48 Laws of Power. I didn't read it for the philosophy. I used it to store the master override key to the estate's electrical grid. "Elena, call your handler at the bureau," I commanded, my voice regaining the authority of the man who once ran the most secure sites in the country. "Tell them the master key is turning on, and tell them if they want Cynthia, they need to be at the Fifth Avenue Gala tomorrow night. But tonight belongs to the family." As the sun began to set over the Atlantic, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn, I began to wire the house, not for light, but for a trap. Julian thought I was a fragile old man. By the time the moon rose over the Hamptons, he would realize that in this house, I wasn't the victim. I was the architect. The sun dipped below the Atlantic horizon, painting the Hamptons sky in bruised purples and deep oranges. I moved through my home with the surgical precision of a man who had spent 40 years masterminding security for the elite. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was a circuit board, and I was the master switch. I opened my MacBook Pro one last time to verify the position of the FedEx box. It had reached a sorting facility in Canada. The bait was thousands of miles away, but the predator was pulling into my driveway. The familiar hum of a high-performance engine vibrated through the floorboards. I didn't need to look at my iPad to know it was Julian's Mercedes S-Class. I grabbed a bottle of Macallan 18 and 2 crystal glasses, setting them on the mahogany table in the center of the living room. I wanted him to see me as a relaxed, unsuspecting old man, the perfect victim. The front door opened without a knock. Julian walked in, his expensive Brioni coat stained with sweat and rain. He looked frantic, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. He held his phone in his hand, his thumb hovering over the screen. "Dad," he panted, not even bothering with a greeting. "We need to talk. Where is the watch? And why does the GPS say you're in the middle of a Canadian forest?" I took a slow sip of the scotch, letting the peat smoke linger on my tongue. "The watch was running a bit fast, Julian. I sent it to a specialist. As for Canada, well, a man my age needs to keep his options open." Julian's face went from pale to a deep, angry crimson. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the crystal. "This isn't a game, Arthur. Do you have any idea who you're messing with? Cynthia's investors. They aren't the type of people who accept specialist repairs. They need that shipment verified tonight." Shipment? I raised an eyebrow, my voice dropping to a whisper. I thought it was a gift, Julian. A thank you for everything I did for you, like when I paid off your first gambling debt in college, or when I bought you that condo in Manhattan so you could start your firm. I didn't realize my love came with military-grade tracking chips. The silence that followed was suffocating. Julian realized then that the mask had slipped. He stopped playing the concerned son and stood up straight, his expression hardening into something cold and unrecognizable. You always were too smart for your own good, Julian sneered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black device, a signal jammer. Cynthia told me you'd be difficult. She said you'd try to be the hero, but you're just an old man in a big house, Dad. You're a relic, and relics get replaced. He pressed a button on the jammer. My house's smart lights flickered and died, plunged into darkness. But Julian didn't see the smile on my face. He didn't know that I had already bypassed the main grid. He was playing checkers while I had built the entire chessboard. Is that what Cynthia told you? I asked, my voice echoing in the dark. That I'm a relic? She forgot that I'm the one who installed the security at the New York Stock Exchange. I know how to disappear things, Julian. Assets, data, and people. I reached under the table and flipped a manual toggle. Suddenly, the floor-to-ceiling windows were covered by heavy automated steel shutters, the kind used in high-end jewelry stores on Fifth Avenue. The sound of the metal slamming shut was like a coffin closing. Julian jumped, his phone falling to the floor. "What are you doing?" he screamed, scrambling for his phone. "I'm giving you what you wanted," I said, standing up. "Uninterrupted quality time with your father. You see, Julian, I didn't just send the watch to Canada. I sent a copy of your offshore bank statements to the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, and the FBI. They should be arriving at Cynthia's penthouse right about now." Julian's eyes widened in horror. He lunged at me, but I stepped aside with a grace he didn't think I possessed. I tapped a command on my Apple Watch, and the room's hidden LED strips bathed the area in a clinical red light. "You betrayed your mother's memory," I said, the pain finally surfacing in my voice. "You let Cynthia dismantle the legacy we built. You thought I was a fragile old man sipping Starbucks and waiting to die. But an engineer knows that when a structure is rotten, you don't patch the walls. You burn it down and start over." From the shadows, Elena stepped out, her suppressed weapon aimed directly at Julian's chest. She wasn't just a gardener. She was the ghost that was going to haunt his nightmares. "Julian Sterling," she said, her voice like cracking ice, "you're under investigation for corporate espionage and conspiracy to commit treason. But tonight you're just a disappointment." Julian fell to his knees, sobbing. He looked at me, pleading for a mercy he didn't deserve. I looked at my son, the man I had raised, and realized I felt nothing. The wire had been cut. The connection was dead. "The game is over, Julian," I said, turning my back on him, "and you lost everything." The red glow of the emergency lights in my living room cast long, jagged shadows against the walls. Julian remained on his knees, his face buried in his hands, sobbing in a way that felt more like self-pity than genuine remorse. Elena kept her gaze fixed on the entrance, her Sig Sauer steady. Outside, the wind howled against the steel shutters I had installed years ago, making the house feel like a pressurized chamber. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a high-pitched melodic chime. It wasn't an alarm. It was the customized ringtone of Julian's iPhone 15 Pro, which lay cracked on the floor. The caller ID displayed a single emoji, a diamond. Cynthia. I picked up the phone. Against the backdrop of the red light, the screen illuminated my wrinkled face. I swiped to answer and put it on speaker. "Julian?" Cynthia's voice was no longer the playful socialite I'd spoken to earlier. It was sharp, cold, and frantic. "Why is the tracker at a post office in the Yukon? And why am I seeing a fleet of black SUVs pulling up to our Park Avenue lobby? Answer me, you idiot!" I cleared my throat, my voice sounding like gravel. "Julian is a bit tied up at the moment, Cynthia. He's rediscovering the meaning of consequences." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. For 3 seconds, there was total silence, save for the muffled sound of sirens in the background of her Manhattan penthouse. "Arthur," she finally hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You old fool! You think you've won because you sent some documents to the feds? You have no idea how deep this goes. Those chips aren't just for money. They are for people much more powerful than a retired electrician and a disgraced gardener." "I was an engineer, Cynthia," I corrected her calmly, leaning against the mahogany table. "And an engineer knows that even the most complex system fails if you remove the primary power source. In this case, that's your bank account. I've frozen the Sterling Trust. You're currently presiding over a kingdom of debt." "You think I didn't have a backup plan?" She laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. "Check your security feed, Arthur. I didn't just send Julian to talk to you. I sent a cleanup crew. If I'm going down, you're coming with me." The line went dead. I looked at Elena. She was already at the monitors, her fingers flying across the keys of my MacBook Pro. "She's not bluffing," Elena said, her voice tight. "3 black Cadillac Escalades just breached the perimeter gate. They didn't use the code, they rammed it. They're armed with tactical gear and thermal imaging." I felt a surge of adrenaline I hadn't felt since my days working on the San Francisco Bay Bridge project. I wasn't scared, I was focused. I looked at Julian, who was now hyperventilating. "Get him into the safe room," I commanded Elena. "The one behind the library. It's lined with 6 inches of reinforced concrete and has its own oxygen supply. Even if they bring the house down, he stays alive to testify." Elena grabbed Julian by the collar of his Brioni suit and dragged him toward the hidden door. As she disappeared into the shadows, I turned toward my workbench. I reached for a Mont Blanc case, but instead of a pen, I pulled out a customized remote detonator I had built for testing high-voltage breakers. I looked at the monitors. The cleanup crew was dismounting from their vehicles. They moved with military precision, carrying specialized equipment designed to burn through steel. They thought they were entering the home of a defenseless senior citizen. They didn't realize they were stepping into a customized kill box. I picked up my Starbucks mug, now cold, and took a final sip. In the reflection of the glass, I saw the man I used to be. The man who understood that every lock has a key, and every predator has a weakness. "You want a show, Cynthia?" I whispered, looking into the camera lens that I knew she was likely monitoring remotely. "I'll give you a masterpiece." I tapped a sequence into my iPad. The house's external floodlights began to strobe at a frequency designed to induce vertigo and seizures in anyone not wearing specialized, polarized lenses. From the garden speakers, a high-decibel subsonic frequency began to thrum, a sound so low it couldn't be heard, but it could be felt in the lungs and the inner ear, causing instant nausea. I watched as the first 2 men reached the porch. They stumbled, dropping their breaching tools as the strobe lights hit them. One of them vomited into the hydrangeas. This was my home, my sanctuary, my legacy. Cynthia had tried to turn it into a crime scene, but I was turning it into a fortress. Every wire I had laid, every sensor I had calibrated, was now working in perfect harmony. "Arthur!" Elena's voice came over the intercom. "Julian is secure. What's your status?" "I'm just checking the connections, Elena," I said, my eyes fixed on the lead mercenary who was now trying to aim a weapon at my front door. "And I think it's time to flip the main breaker." I reached for the red toggle on my desk. This was the moment of no return. Once I pulled this, the sterling name would be forever tarnished. The wealth would be gone, and the life I knew would be ashes. But as I thought of my late wife and the way Julian had spat on her memory, my hand didn't shake. I flipped the switch. The entire estate groaned as the backup generators surged. A wall of blue electrical arcs danced across the perimeter fence, sealing the driveway. The cleanup crew was now trapped inside the grounds with me. "Welcome to the Hamptons," I muttered. "I hope you brought more than just guns." The humming of the high-voltage generators beneath the floorboards felt like a living pulse, a mechanical heart keeping my sanctuary alive while the world outside descended into chaos. I stood in the center of my workshop, surrounded by the tools of a lifetime: snap-on wrenches, digital oscilloscopes, and my trusted MacBook Pro, which was now a command center for a private war. On the monitor, I watched the lead mercenary, a man whose face was a mask of cold professionalism, try to regain his footing after the sonic blast. He signaled his team to deploy gas masks and thermal goggles. They were adapting, but adaptation is a two-way street. "Elena, they're moving to the east wing," I said into the intercom, my voice tight but clear. "They're going to try and bypass the shutters by cutting through the brickwork near the pantry. They have thermal lances." "I'm in position, Arthur," Elena's voice crackled back. "Julian is secure in the vault, but he's losing it. He's babbling about a black box Cynthia mentioned. He says it's hidden in the foundations of this house. Did you build something into the basement that I don't know about?" I froze. A black box. I looked at the framed photograph on my desk. My late wife, Martha, smiling in front of this very house 40 years ago. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, sharp and jagged. When I had renovated the basement in the late 90s, I had been hired by a private defense contractor to stress test a prototype for an unhackable data storage unit. I had used the house's foundation as a cooling sink. I thought the project had been scrapped and the data wiped. I had forgotten it was even there. Cynthia hadn't married Julian for his charm or his family name. She had married him because she had found the old schematics in my attic years ago. She was after the hardware buried under my feet, data that, in the right hands, could destabilize the entire NASDAQ or worse. "It's not a box, Elena," I whispered, the weight of the realization pressing down on my chest. "It's a server node. If they get to it, they don't just get money. They get the keys to the kingdom." A deafening boom shook the house. The east wall had been breached. I could hear the hiss of the thermal lances melting through the reinforced steel I had so carefully installed. I grabbed a heavy-duty maglite and a specialized circuit breaker tool. I had to get to the basement before they did. As I hurried through the darkened hallway, the strobe lights outside continued to flash, casting rhythmic, nauseating shadows. I reached the library where the secret entrance to the vault in the basement was hidden behind a row of leather-bound classics. I pulled a copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and the shelf groaned open. I descended the stone steps into the cold, damp air of the sub-basement. The smell of old ozone and wet concrete filled my lungs. I reached the far corner, where a massive Amazon delivery box was stored, or so it appeared. Behind it sat a panel of rusted iron. I pulled it back to reveal a glowing blue LED array. The node was active. It had been silently collecting and encrypting data for decades, powered by a trickle charge from the main grid. "Arthur, they're inside!" Elena's voice screamed through my earpiece, followed by the rapid-fire pop, pop, pop of her suppressed weapon. "There's too many of them. I'm pinned down in the kitchen." Numbing fear tried to take hold, but I pushed it back. I looked at the server. This was the source of my son's greed. This was the reason my wife's memory had been tarnished. This was the blood money Cynthia wanted. I pulled my iPhone 15 Pro from my pocket and connected it to the node's maintenance port. "Elena, hold them for 3 minutes," I shouted. "I'm going to vent the cooling system. It'll flood the basement with liquid nitrogen. No one gets the data if the processors are shattered." "Arthur, if you do that, the structural integrity of the floor above will fail," Elena warned. "The house will collapse." I looked around at the home I had built with my own hands. I saw the marks on the wall where we had measured Julian's height as a child. I saw the workbench where I had spent thousands of happy hours. It was just wood and stone. It was a shell. My legacy wasn't this building. It was my honor. "Let it fall," I said, my thumb hovering over the execute command on my screen. Suddenly, a shadow fell over the basement stairs. I turned, expecting a mercenary, but I saw Julian. He had escaped the vault. He was covered in dust, his Brioni suit torn, but his eyes were wide with a manic, desperate hunger. "Give it to me, Dad," he rasped, holding a jagged piece of glass from a broken bottle. "Cynthia said if I bring her the drive, she'll fix everything. She said we can go to the Caymans. We can start over. Just give me the drive." The heartbreak I felt in that moment was deeper than any physical wound. My son was willing to kill me for a piece of silicon. He wasn't a victim of Cynthia. He was her twin. "Julian," I said, my voice trembling, "look at what you've become." "I've become a winner," he screamed, lunging at me. I didn't move. I didn't have to. I simply pressed enter on my phone. A high-pitched hiss filled the room as the nitrogen tanks blew. A cloud of white, freezing mist erupted from the floor, instantly frosting the walls. Julian slipped, falling onto the freezing floor, screaming as the cold bit into his skin. "It's over, Julian," I said, backing toward the emergency exit. "The connection is severed." As I climbed the ladder to the garden, I heard the house begin to groan, a deep metallic wail of a structure reaching its breaking point. I scrambled out into the rain just as the east wing began to sag. I didn't look back. I looked toward the gate, where the blue and red lights of the FBI task force were finally appearing in the distance. I had lost my home. I had lost my son. But as I stood in the pouring rain, I felt a strange, cold purity. The rot was gone. Part 6. The Night of the Cracking Foundation. The rain over the Hamptons turned into a torrential downpour, a relentless sheet of water that masked the sounds of destruction. I stood on the edge of the lawn, my iPhone 15 Pro clutched in a trembling hand, watching the silhouette of my life's work, my home, shudder under the internal pressure of the nitrogen blast. The east wing didn't just collapse, it surrendered. The brickwork groaned and buckled, and for a moment the sound of the ocean was replaced by the screeching of twisted metal. "Elena, report!" I shouted into my earpiece, the cold rain soaking through my North Face jacket. I'm out!" Her voice came through, ragged and breathless. I saw her shadow emerge from the side terrace, dragging a limp body. It was Julian. He was shivering violently, his Brioni suit now a rag of frozen wool, his skin a deathly shade of blue. She dropped him onto the wet grass several yards away from the sagging structure. Behind them, the front door burst open. The lead mercenary stumbled out, his thermal goggles cracked, his tactical vest frosted over with white crystals. He tried to raise his weapon, but his fingers were likely frostbitten, unable to find the trigger. He collapsed onto the porch, gasping for air that wasn't filled with nitrogen. I didn't feel a sense of victory. I felt a hollow, aching void. I walked toward Julian, my boots sinking into the mud. He looked up at me, his teeth chattering so hard I thought they might shatter. You killed it," he wheezed, his eyes darting toward the basement where the server node was now surely a block of useless ice and shattered silicon. "You destroyed the only thing that could have saved me, Dad. Cynthia. She'll never forgive this. They'll kill us both now." "Cynthia is the one who killed you, Julian," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "She killed the son I knew the moment she put a tracker on my car. She killed this family when she tried to turn my basement into a treasonous data hub. I just finished the job." Suddenly, the night was illuminated by a blinding white light. A fleet of black Chevrolet Suburbans roared up the driveway, their sirens silent but their high beams cutting through the rain like scalpels. FBIHRT, Hostage Rescue Team. Teams swarmed out, their boots hitting the gravel in a synchronized rhythm. "Federal agents, nobody move!" the loudspeakers boomed. I put my hands up, the cold metal of my phone still pressed against my palm. I saw a familiar figure step out from the lead vehicle, Special Agent Miller. He looked at the collapsing house, then at the frozen mercenaries on my porch, and finally at me. "Arthur Sterling," Miller said, walking toward me while his team moved to secure Julian and the remaining intruders. "You were supposed to wait for the signal. You just turned a multi-million-dollar surveillance operation into a demolition site." "The system was compromised, Agent Miller," I replied. My gaze fixed on Julian as he was being handcuffed and wrapped in a thermal blanket. As an engineer, I had to isolate the failure. The data node is destroyed. The black box Cynthia wanted is now nothing but dust. Miller sighed, looking at the wreckage. We have Cynthia in custody in Manhattan. She was trying to board a private jet at Teterboro with $3 million in cash and a forged passport. But we needed that server to link her to the international buyers. Without it, our case is built on paper and promises. Not quite, I said. I handed him my iPhone. I didn't just vent the nitrogen. I mirrored the last 60 seconds of the data transfer to my private cloud before the hardware shattered. It's all there. The buyer's IP addresses, the transaction codes, and the voice recordings of Cynthia authorizing the cleanup of this estate. Miller took the phone, his expression shifting from frustration to a grim sort of respect. You risked your life and your home to get this? The house was already haunted, Miller, I said, looking back at the dark windows of the library. It's better this way. As they loaded Julian into the back of a van, he looked at me one last time. There was no apology in his eyes, only a desperate, lingering greed. He was looking at me as if I were the one who had betrayed him. I realized then that some connections can't be repaired. They have to be cut entirely to prevent the fire from spreading. Elena walked over to me, wiping a smudge of grease and blood from her forehead. She looked at the house, then at the FBI teams crawling over the property like ants. What now, Arthur? She asked quietly. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. The tremors of the last 3 days were gone. I thought about the Sterling Legacy Trust, the money that was finally safe from Cynthia's reach. I thought about the kids who would get scholarships because of this. Now, I said, I think I'd like a cup of coffee, somewhere far away from the Hamptons. I turned my back on the ruins of my past. The sirens were finally audible in the distance, a rising chorus of accountability. The architect had finished his final project. The structure was gone, but for the first time in a decade, the foundation was clean. Part 7. The Ghosts of Park Avenue. The aftermath of the explosion at the Hamptons estate left a silence that was even more deafening than the blast itself. As the FBI forensic teams picked through the charred, frozen remains of my basement, I was ushered into a secure suite at the Park Hyatt, New York. Agent Miller had insisted on high-level protection, but as I stood on the balcony overlooking the rain-slick streets of Midtown, I didn't feel protected. I felt like a man who had successfully amputated a gangrenous limb, but was still waiting to see if the infection had reached his heart. I opened my MacBook Pro and stared at the mirrored data I had saved. The transaction logs were a roadmap of greed. Cynthia hadn't just been selling data. She had been brokering the movement of high-value political assets using the Sterling name as a shield. The black box wasn't just a server. It was a ledger of every shadow deal made in Manhattan over the last decade. A soft knock at the door broke my concentration. It was Elena. She had changed into a clean, sharp suit, her hair pulled back, looking less like a gardener and more like the federal operative she truly was. She carried 2 cups of Starbucks and a small, unassuming Amazon box. You look like you haven't slept since the Ford administration, Arthur, she said, placing the coffee on the mahogany desk. Sleep is for people who don't have their family's treason playing on a loop in their heads, I replied, taking a sip of the hot liquid. What's in the box? A peace offering, she said, sliding it toward me, and a warning. I opened the box. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a new iPhone 15 Pro, already encrypted. But it was the journal that caught my eye. It was my wife Martha's diary from the year we built the house. I flipped to a bookmarked page. The handwriting was elegant, precise. Arthur thinks he is building a fortress for us, it read, but I fear he is building a vault. Julian watches him work with a hunger that isn't about learning. It's about owning. I pray the boy learns that a house is only as strong as the truth told inside its walls. The tears I had been holding back for 3 days finally blurred my vision. Martha had seen it 40 years ago. She had seen the rot in Julian before he even knew it himself. I had been so busy securing the world that I had failed to secure my own son's character. "There's more," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Cynthia's lawyers are already moving. They've filed a motion to suppress the data you mirrored. They're claiming you're a senile, disgruntled father who fabricated the evidence out of spite. They've even produced a medical evaluation signed by a doctor on their payroll, claiming you have early-onset dementia." I felt a cold, familiar rage tighten in my chest. They want to play the crazy old man card? Fine, let them play it. But an engineer knows that the best way to prove a system works is to run a live stress test. "What are you thinking, Arthur?" "Cynthia is being held at the federal courthouse for her bail hearing tomorrow morning," I said, looking at the Rolex on the nightstand, a watch I had actually bought for myself, one that didn't have a tracker. She thinks she's going to walk out of there and disappear into the shadows. She thinks Julian is the only one who can testify against her, and she knows he's too terrified to speak. "She's right," Elena sighed. "Julian is catatonic in a holding cell. He won't say a word without a plea deal that the DA isn't willing to give yet." "He doesn't need to speak," I said, standing up. "I have the master override. Cynthia's entire empire is built on digital prestige. Every luxury condo, every smart skyscraper she owns in this city is connected to the Sterling grid I designed. She forgot that I didn't just build the security, I built the architecture." I grabbed my Mont Blanc pen and a piece of hotel stationery. I began sketching a schematic from memory, a back door into the Manhattan Central Utility Hub. "If I can't put her in a cage with the data I took," I muttered, "I'll turn the entire city into her cage. I'm going to trigger a security audit on every property she owns. Every elevator will stop. Every digital lock will freeze. Every cent in her offshore accounts will be flagged for an immediate KYC, know your customer violation, by the central bank's AI." Elena looked at me with a mix of awe and terror. "Arthur, that's scorched earth. You'll be investigated too?" "I have nothing left to lose, Elena. My house is gone. My son is a stranger. My wife is a memory." I looked her square in the eye. "Cynthia wanted to use my genius to build a shadow world. Now she's going to find out what happens when the architect decides to pull the plug." The point of no return had been crossed long ago in the reign of the Hamptons. Now, in the heart of the world's financial capital, I was preparing for the final shutdown. Cynthia thought she was a queen on Fifth Avenue. She was about to realize she was just a glitch in my system. "Get me a secure line to the DA," I commanded, "and tell them to be at the courthouse at 8 a.m. I'm going to give them a show that no medical evaluation can debunk." As the city lights flickered outside, I sat back down at my MacBook. My fingers moved across the keys with the rhythm of a conductor. The drama was no longer about survival. It was about the absolute cold-blooded restoration of the Sterling name. The twist she never saw coming wasn't that I was smart. It was that I was willing to destroy everything to ensure she had nothing. Part 8. The Courthouse Surge. The morning at the Southern District of New York courthouse was gray and oppressive. A fleet of black Cadillac Escalades and news vans from every major network lined the curb. This was the moment Cynthia had prepared for, the theater of her innocence. Inside my suite at the Park Hyatt, I had spent the last 6 hours drinking black Starbucks coffee and writing a script of a different kind. My MacBook Pro was connected to a specialized portable satellite uplink. I wasn't just going to the courthouse, I was going to become the ghost in its machine. "Arthur, the DA is ready," Elena said, checking her Apple Watch. She looked at me, her expression a mix of concern and admiration. "Are you sure about this? Once you trigger the audit, there's no way to hide your footprint. They'll know it was you." "Let them," I replied, sliding my Mont Blanc pen into my pocket. An architect doesn't hide when he's tearing down a faulty structure. He stands back and watches the physics work. We arrived at the courthouse 10 minutes before the hearing. The lobby was a sea of cameras and reporters. Suddenly, the crowd parted. Cynthia walked in, flanked by 4 lawyers in $5,000 suits. She was wearing a Dior power suit and a pair of Cartier glasses that masked any hint of fear. When her eyes met mine, she didn't flinch. She gave me a small, pitying smile, the kind you give to a confused child. It was the smile that sealed her fate. The courtroom was packed. Julian was brought in through a side door, looking like a ghost of the man he once was. He sat as far away from me as possible, his eyes fixed on his shoes. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, took her seat. "Your Honor," Cynthia's lead attorney began, his voice projecting through the room, "we move for an immediate dismissal. The so-called evidence provided by Mr. Arthur Sterling is the product of a deteriorating mind. We have medical affidavits proving Mr. Sterling suffers from cognitive decline. He is a disgruntled father trying to destroy his son's career because he cannot accept his own irrelevance." A murmur ran through the room. I felt the eyes of the public on me. Pity, judgment, curiosity. I looked at Julian. He wouldn't even look up. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, looking at me, "do you have anything to say to these allegations before I rule on the admissibility of the digital evidence?" I stood up slowly, leaning on the mahogany railing. I didn't look at the judge. I looked at Cynthia. "Engineering is about truth," I said, my voice echoing in the silent chamber. "A bridge doesn't care about your lawyers. A circuit doesn't care about your Dior suit. It either holds the load or it fails. Cynthia, you told the court I'm a man of the past. You're right. I'm from a time when a man's name meant everything. And since you've used my name to build your empire, I think it's time I took it back." I reached into my pocket and pressed a single button on my iPhone 15 Pro. In an instant, the courtroom's digital displays flickered and died. The lights dimmed to a low, emergency red. A collective gasp went up from the gallery. But that was just the beginning. "What is the meaning of this?" the judge demanded. "It's an audit, Your Honor," I said calmly. On the giant projection screens behind the judge's bench, a live feed appeared. It wasn't the court's documents. It was a real-time map of Manhattan, specifically every property owned by Sterling Developments. One by one, the icons turned from green to red. At this moment, I continued, every smart lock in Cynthia's Fifth Avenue penthouse has engaged. Every elevator in her Park Avenue tower has returned to the lobby and locked its doors. And every offshore account associated with these properties, accounts the FBI hasn't even found yet, is currently broadcasting its transaction history directly to the Department of Justice's main server. Cynthia stood up, her face turning a ghastly shade of gray. "Stop him! He's hacking the system!" "I'm not hacking, Cynthia," I said, stepping toward the center of the room. "I'm the architect. I'm just using the back door I built 30 years ago. You thought you were buying my legacy. You were just moving into a trap I designed before you even knew how to lie." On the screen, a video began to play. It was the black box data, the footage from the Hamptons basement. It showed Julian and Cynthia discussing the sale of the microchips. The audio was crystal clear. "The old man won't know," Cynthia's voice rang out through the courtroom speakers. "He's a relic. We use his name, we get the chips across the border, and then we put him in a home. He's a walking insurance policy, Julian. Nothing more." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian let out a broken, strangled sob. Cynthia sank back into her chair, the mask of the Fifth Avenue socialite finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. The judge looked at the screen, then at the lawyers, and finally at me. There was no more talk of dementia. There was only the cold, hard reality of the evidence. "Motion to dismiss is denied," the judge whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "Bail is revoked. Bailiffs, take the defendants into custody." As the officers moved in, Cynthia looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like heat. But I didn't feel the burn. I felt the weight of 40 years of lies finally lifting off my shoulders. I looked at my son as they led him away in handcuffs. He looked back, and for a split second, I saw the little boy who used to help me in the garage. But then the flash of the cameras took over, and he was gone. I walked out of the courthouse and into the rain. Elena was waiting by the car holding a fresh Starbucks. "You did it, Arthur," she said. "No," I said, looking up at the gray Manhattan sky. "The system did it. I just made sure the connections were tight." The architect was done. The structure had fallen, but the ground was finally level. Part 9. The calm after the storm. The neon lights of Times Square flickered in the distance, but the silence inside my room at the Park Hyatt was absolute. For the first time in what felt like decades, the weight on my chest had lifted. Cynthia was behind bars, her assets frozen, and Julian was facing a reality he had spent his whole life trying to outrun. I sat at the mahogany desk, my MacBook Pro closed. I didn't need schematics anymore. I didn't need to monitor frequencies. The system had reached its final state of equilibrium. Elena came in, carrying a small paper bag from Barnes & Noble. She looked relaxed, the tension in her shoulders finally gone. She handed me a book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fk by Mark Manson. "A gift for your retirement," she said with a small, genuine smile. "I think you've spent enough time caring about people who didn't care about you, Arthur." I laughed, a sound that felt foreign in my own throat. "I think I'm more of a Marcus Aurelius man, Elena, but I'll take the sentiment." We sat in silence for a moment, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. The city looked different now. It wasn't just a collection of steel and glass to be secured. It was a place where life happened. I realized that for 40 years I had been so focused on the locks that I forgot to look at what was being protected. "What happens to the Hamptons property?" Elena asked. "I'm selling the land," I said. "The house is a total loss, and honestly, I don't want to rebuild it. I've already contacted a developer who specializes in eco-friendly parks. I'm donating the proceeds to the Sterling Legacy Trust. We're going to build a vocational center for kids who want to learn how to build things with their hands, real things. No tracking chips, no hidden agendas, just honest engineering." "And Julian?" I looked at my iPhone 15 Pro, which was sitting on the table. There were no missed calls, no messages. The silence was his answer. "Julian has to find his own way back to the truth. I can't build that bridge for him. I've spent my life trying to fix his mistakes, and all it did was make him more efficient at making them. He needs to sit in that cell and realize that a name is only as good as the man who carries it." The doorbell of the suite rang. It was a courier delivering a package from Tiffany & Company. My heart skipped a beat, thinking it was another gift from Cynthia's remaining associates. But when I opened the blue box, there was no jewelry. Inside was a simple silver key ring with a vintage Ford emblem. There was a note. "Found this in the rubble of the garage. It was in a fireproof safe. I thought you might want it back. Agent Miller." It was the key to the 1972 Ford F-100, the truck that had started this whole mess. The truck my father had given me when I graduated from trade school. It was a piece of my true legacy, a reminder of a time when things were simple and a man's word was his bond. "You know," I said, holding the cold metal of the key, "I think I'm going to go get that truck restored. I'll take it down to Florida. I hear the weather is better for old engines and old men." "Florida, huh?" Elena leaned against the window frame. "What are you going to do there? Sit on a beach and drink Starbucks all day?" "No," I smiled. "I think I'm going to teach. There's a community college near Sarasota that's looking for a guest lecturer in systems ethics. I think I have a few stories they might find useful." Elena nodded, her eyes soft. "I think you'd be a great teacher, Arthur. You certainly taught me a lot. And what about you, Elena? Back to the FBI?" "Maybe for a while," she said. "But I think I've developed a taste for gardening, real gardening. I might look for a place with a bit of land, maybe somewhere near Sarasota." I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the central heating. I had lost a son, but I had gained a friend. I had lost a house, but I had found my home. The Sterling name wasn't a corporate brand anymore. It was a promise. I picked up my Mont Blanc pen and wrote a final letter to Julian. I didn't lecture him. I didn't scold him. I just wrote, "The door isn't locked, Julian, but you have to be the one to turn the handle. Whenever you're ready to tell the truth, I'll be listening." I licked the envelope and set it aside. The sun was beginning to set over the Hudson River, casting a golden light over the city. I felt a sense of profound peace. The architect had walked away from the wreckage, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for a structural flaw. I was just looking at the view. The connections were finally tight, the circuit was complete, and the lights were staying on. Part 10. The New Blueprint. Rebirth. The humidity of the Florida Gulf Coast was a far cry from the biting winds of the Hamptons, but for the first time in my life, the air felt easy to breathe. I sat on the porch of my new bungalow in Sarasota, a modest but structurally perfect home that smelled of salt air and high-quality cedar. On the teak-side table sat a half-finished cup of Starbucks blonde roast and my well-worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I wasn't monitoring security grids or tracing encrypted signals anymore. I was watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and violet, colors that no high-definition monitor could ever truly replicate. Elena walked up the driveway, her skin tanned and her expression more relaxed than I had ever seen it. She was carrying a leather satchel and a small Amazon box. She had officially transitioned from being a ghost in the federal system to a consultant for my new foundation. The final papers for the Kowalski-Sterling Vocational Center just cleared Arthur, she said, pulling up a chair. The first class of aspiring engineers starts in September. We have 300 applicants for 50 spots. It turns out there are a lot of kids who still want to know how the world actually works, not just how to trade pixels on a screen. I felt a surge of pride, a clean, honest emotion that didn't come with a hidden cost. That's the best news I've heard all year, Elena. Did we secure the lab equipment from Apple and Microsoft? Everything is in transit, she replied, tapping her iPad Pro. And the best part, the funding is entirely transparent. Cynthia's lawyers tried one last time to freeze the trust, but the judge threw it out. She's currently serving her second month of a 15-year sentence at Danbury. From what I hear, she's not enjoying the lack of Cartier accessories. I nodded slowly. I didn't feel joy in Cynthia's suffering, but I felt a profound sense of justice. The system had been purged of its rot, but then my mind drifted to the one connection that still had a dial tone, however faint. "And Julian?" I asked. Elena's expression softened. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a plain white envelope. "He sent this to the foundation office. He didn't have your new address." I took the letter. My fingers traced the familiar, hurried handwriting. I opened it and read the few lines written on lined yellow paper. Prison stationery. "Dad, I'm working in the prison machine shop. They're teaching me how to fix industrial lathes. It's the first time I've used my hands for something real in 20 years. You were right about the foundation. The structure has to be solid. I'm not asking for forgiveness yet. I don't deserve it. But I'm finally learning how to read a blueprint. I hope one day I can show you what I've built." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside my book. I wasn't ready to visit him, and he wasn't ready to be seen. But the wire wasn't cut anymore. It was just being re-insulated. For a man who dealt in certainties, maybe was a beautiful word. "He's learning to build," I whispered to the breeze. "That's a start." Suddenly, a loud rhythmic rumble echoed down the quiet street. A vintage 1972 Ford F-100, painted a brilliant deep cobalt blue, pulled up to the curb. The chrome bumpers caught the last rays of the sun, gleaming like a promise kept. The driver, a young man from the local restoration shop, hopped out with a grin. "She's finished, Mr. Sterling. Tuned her myself. She runs smoother than a brand new Mercedes S-Class." I walked down to the curb, running my hand along the cool metal of the hood. This truck was the only thing I had left from my old life, but it had been stripped down to the frame and rebuilt with better parts, better care, and a better purpose. It was a metaphor for my own existence. "She's perfect," I said, handing the young man a generous tip. I climbed into the driver's seat. The smell of old leather and gasoline filled the cabin, the scent of my father, of my youth, and of honest work. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a steady, confident thrum. No trackers, no microphones, just internal combustion and freedom. "Want to go for a drive, Elena?" I called out. "I hear there's a little place on the pier that serves the best crab cakes in Florida." "Only if you're buying, architect," she laughed, climbing into the passenger seat. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked at the rearview mirror. I saw the quiet, sun-drenched street, the palm trees swaying, and the peaceful life I had fought so hard to reclaim. I had lost a fortune, a mansion, and a son's loyalty, but I had gained something Cynthia could never understand, a soul that was no longer for sale. I drove toward the horizon, the blue truck humming a song of rebirth. The architect had finished his final masterpiece, not a building of stone, but a life of integrity. The connections were tight, the ground was level, and for the first time in 78 years, the lights ahead were nothing but green.